I just want to make a video about an issue that has been talked about a lot, certainly in the last 15 years or before that, and is probably one of the most commonly discussed topics today, which is, how is it that the middle class has eroded so significantly in its earning power, in its ability to withstand economic shocks, and just an overall feeling, especially in the U.S., that higher education, healthcare, housing have all just increased beyond people's capacity to manage it and live a decent middle class life where they can save, for emergencies and retirement and so on. So it's become very almost canonical or popular to say these problems all started with Reagan in the 1980s, and something about inflation with the very, very dramatic inflation that happened in the 80s. But the problems actually predate Reagan substantially, although Reagan harnessed them and made them worse. The problems themselves started mostly in the 1970s. So you can go farther back than that. Prior to the 70s, inflation was largely kept in check because the U.S. Adhered to the gold standard, and it provided a very stable kind of backing for U.S. currency. When Nixon moved away from the gold standard in the 70s, that allowed the currency to float, and it allowed for the possibility of inflation to rise at a more dramatic and less controlled rate, which is exactly what ended up happening. The other thing that was happening at the same time, among other things, was oil shocks. Oil increasing in cost as much as quadruple cost due to the Yom Kippur War and also the turbulence in Iran, in the 70s and the deposing of the Shah and so on. So world events kind of pushed the price of oil up. That affected the cost of transportation and manufacturing and all kinds of things. And so that inflation rose by 7 or 8% a year during that time, which was shocking for people because most people who grew up in the post-World War II era just hadn't experienced anything like that. It was very much like the distress that a lot of people felt after the pandemic today was felt at that time. So how does that affect all the other things? Well, we can sort of go through them one by one. So higher education, back in the 70s, a lot of higher education funding came from property taxes. And as people, were seeing seeing inflation rising beyond what they were able to handle because their wages weren't keeping pace with that inflation, they became upset that their property taxes kept going up because obviously the value of their home would go up indexed to inflation, and yet they weren't receiving any higher income. So especially for retirees or people living on a modest or fixed income, it was becoming harder and harder for them to afford their homes because of property taxes. So California started with a proposition in the late 70s that capped property taxes at 1% of the total assessed value and capped increases at 2% per year. Obviously quite quite a mixed bag in terms of how that affects things. That had a huge impact on budgets for public universities, and they were in a financial crisis. So because of that, they weren't going to get help from government funding. They started raising tuition, and it became very popular and very almost religious belief in state and local and federal governments that where you cut, the first place you cut is higher education. That became a habit over the course of 40, 50 years. So that, every time there would be good economic times, there wouldn't be, a kind of reinvestment. It was just sort of locked in that higher education was on its own, and they would have to absorb any costs that it had by increasing tuition costs. And over time, higher ed became more and more competitive, more and more market-based. That led to, building out amenities like, giant athletic stadiums and a huge amount of administration and marketing budgets. And over time, that extra bloat just drove those costs up more and more and more, to the point now where the U.S. Has incredibly unaffordable higher education prices on average. So it all starts with decisions made 50 years ago. So that's higher education. In terms of housing, which is another huge cost for the middle class, I mean, there's some similarities to that story, and it really also started in the 70s, when governments and state and local authorities stopped building public housing, and homeowners became more and more powerful, especially in the years after World War II, when a signifier of middle class achievement was that you owned your own home. So because of that, as homeowners became a very, very powerful political constituency, and homeowners as a bloc would resist any high density development, or any new developments at all, or any kind of zoning changes. Because of that, the amount of available land, the amount of available places you could build, or the kind of construction you could build was so constrained that pushed prices up higher and higher and higher. At the same time, housing became a kind of a financial commodity. As people's pensions became smaller, as union membership dwindled, housing became like your fallback plan. So because of that, people saw their home as something that was more of a financial asset than shelter. So as that happened, Wall Street got involved, started speculating on homes, using it almost like a stock, or a financial instrument, as we all know. And then, of course, this was all, that sort of smoldering fire became an inferno in the years after 2008, when interest rates were driven to near zero for many, many, many years, which further increased that housing kind of inflation, which occurred year after year after year, with at the same time severe disinvestment in public housing or affordable housing or anything like that. So those problems exist till today. So it really all starts in the 1970s. Then the two other things I want to talk about is healthcare and union membership, because all these things are related to each other. So the more your spending power gets eroded, and the more policy decisions favor the wealthy and favor those who already have something, the more this problem starts to snowball. So when we talk about healthcare is a little bit longer history than those, but it's along similar lines. So the United States has been talking about public healthcare option for a very long time, 100 years or more. FDR was interested in that. Johnson, variety of different administrations attempted to institute some sort of public health care, and some succeeded by instituting Medicare and Medicaid, which sort of pointed the way forward, but it never ended up fully coming to fruition. And probably the biggest reason why that never happened is kind of a strange one to modern ears, is that throughout a lot of the history of the 20th century, the American government was divided into a Democratic Party that was very segregationist. A lot of the Southern senators were Democrats, yes, but they strongly believed that in white supremacy and segregation. And their concern was, if we have universal health care, that black people will have health care, and that's not fair. It should be for white people. It sounds almost bizarre to hear it now, but that was an incredibly powerful force. It constrained FDR. It constrained a lot of presidents leading into the 60s until finally, in the 70s, the Southern segregationists moved to the Republican Party. Didn't fix the problem with healthcare, but that's one of the reasons why healthcare was so unfixable for many, many years. The second problem was lobbying by insurance lobbying groups, as well as the American Medical Association was a very powerful lobby against universal healthcare, because they were concerned that their fees would be eroded by that. So the last thing I would talk about is union membership. Again, these are all related. So, as these price shocks of higher cost for healthcare, higher cost for higher education, higher cost for housing, start to squeeze middle class, homeowners, um, the concomitant problem was that, in the years immediately after World War II, union membership in the U.S. was very high, like 35% of people belonging to a union, but that eroded dramatically, especially in the 70s and certainly the 80s. The reasons why union membership decreased so dramatically were the business finally got organized. They were getting their own profits eroded by the economic issues in the 1970s, and they banded together and worked together to lobby states to pass right to work laws, and busting unions and disrupting the organization, and overall kind of creating a climate of anti-unionism in the United States, which really culminated with Reagan and the confrontation with the air traffic controllers, and continues to today, until the point where you even see people on the center left arguing that unions are no good, or having all kinds of negative stories about unions. And that's really kind of, at the end of the day, you can talk about higher education, you can talk about healthcare, you can talk about housing as issues, but one of the biggest problems is people don't often realize that all of these things, all of these forces, are deliberate policy choices that were made over time, by governments that were afraid of getting voted out, or about powerful business interests, and that this has been going on for most of our lifetimes. And really the only way to do something about it is to make different policy choices, and to understand the reasons why these things have come to pass, and start to do something about them. And in order to do that, we can look at other countries than the United States, which avoided a lot of these shocks, not all of them, but avoided many of these shocks, and consider some policy correctives and some different ways of thinking that can help kind of restore a much more stable and much more prosperous middle class.